Hello and welcome to Prairie's Got the Goods Week. My name is Caitlin Rose Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Omar de Kok-Mercado and Timothy Youngquist of Iowa State University will be speaking about science-based trials of row crops integrated with prairie strips, an overview of research and implementation. I'd like to start by stating we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. Before we get going, I'd like to mention that we are halfway through Prairie's Got the Goods Week. There are 3 more webinars happening this week for Prairie's Got the Goods Week. This afternoon, there will be a webinar about ecological goods and services from an Indigenous perspective. Tomorrow's webinar is about pollination, followed by carbon sequestration on Friday. And you can register for these webinars on the PCAP website. Just click on upcoming events and then Prairie's Got the Goods Week. All past webinar presentations can be found on the PCAP YouTube channel, and this webinar will be available there in the near future as well. And a reminder to our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation. And if you are on a cell phone app, you can send it by chat to the organizer, and questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsors, Enbridge and Wildlife Habitat Canada. Our supporting sponsors are Eco-Friendly West, Information Services Corporation, Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, and in-kind support has been provided by Iowa State University. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters. Omar de Kok-Mercado coordinates the Strips team at Iowa State University and most recently led the team in the development of the USDA Conservation Reserve Program, Prairie Strips Policy, CP43. Tim Youngquist is the Farmer Liaison for the Strips team at Iowa State University and works directly with farmers and landowners to design, implement, and manage prairie strips. So with that, I'm passing it over to Omar first. Is that right?
Yep.
Perfect.
Great. And let's all right. Well, thanks so much to PCAP for hosting Tim and I here today. So we're here on behalf of Iowa State University. We're based in Ames, Iowa, which is central Iowa. And so we're a large team of scientists, educators, farmers, and extension specialists. And we're researching prairie strips, which is a farmland conservation practice that strategically integrates prairie into row crop fields. And I'm gonna shut my video off just to make sure I don't have a lag here. So let's see. Okay. I'd like to acknowledge our team is a large transdisciplinary team. The work wouldn't be possible without over 60 undergraduate technicians, and we've partnered with over 60 farmers and farmland owners, and we also have a really large broad-based partnership and support from nonprofit conservation organizations, governmental organizations, private industry, and yeah, a whole large gambit of folks that want to reconstruct prairies and have them be seen on the agricultural landscape. So we just want to thank all of our partners. So our research isn't possible without broad support and farmer leadership, and that's what makes our science possible. And our research started back in 2007 with this question of how do we balance the need for food and energy with clean water, pollinator habitat, and the need for ecosystem services. So we had this crazy idea of how do we balance the need for food and conservation, and we thought to do some research on what the effect of integrating prairie into row crop fields would be. And this is what it looks like. It's a prairie within a row crop field. and it can be integrated in multiple different ways. It's not necessarily a linear practice. So this is a field with triticale, then the prairie strip, and then there's corn that's intersected with waterways. This is that same farm field from a different perspective. And yeah, they're on average at least 30 feet wide. And this is one of our research sites near Lewis, Iowa. And you can see that, you know, at the base of the slope there, it's not necessarily a linear strip. It's more of a, just kind of a patch. And that's in Iowa. So why do we choose prairie? Prairie is perennial. It has really deep roots, some up to 6 feet or more. Those stiff stems that stay upright in a pounding rain slow water down and allow it to infiltrate. The diversity of a prairie makes it more resilient in different climatic conditions, so that there's always something actively growing, regardless of whether it's a drought or if it's wet or anything in between. And then it's also native to, you know, a really large swath, as I'm sure a lot of the listeners are familiar. Prairie once covered 170 million acres in North America, from Alaska to Texas. So yeah, it's just a really dynamic, diverse, and resilient vegetative community that we can utilize in our row crop fields. So back in 2007, we had an initial experiment where we had 12 different watersheds where we implemented 4 treatments. The first treatment being 100% crop, and then the next 2 treatments having 10% prairie, 1 just at the toe slope, and then 1 spread out throughout the field in strips, and then the last one being 20% prairie. And this is kind of what that looks like. This is one of the experimental watersheds where we have 10% prairie in strips, and then a patch on the toe slope. And then we have these experimental flumes that capture water, where we can look at sediment and nutrient flows at the base of the toe slope. So our initial findings, now if you want to look at a summary of our research, the one I would point you to is our publication in 2017 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. That's a really great summary paper, and yeah, happy to link that too with the webinar resources. But here's a great visual representation of our findings. This is 100% crops, 100% prairie, and then 90% crops and 10% prairie. And this, I really like this photo to demonstrate just the severity of, you know, just having 100% crop without any conservation practice. This is after a 4-inch rain event, and it's going up to, you know, ankle deep on our colleague Chris Whitty's boots there. So yeah, this is back in 2018. We had 36 existing sites that had prairie strips with 7 paired comparison sites. And now we've grown to a regional base where we have 6 states with 66 commercial farms, farm collaborators directly working with us across 81 fields. So we have 621 acres of prairie strips planted on commercial farms where we're doing some kind of research or some sort of partnership with our farm collaborators. So we're looking at a lot of different things within our research group: crop yield and profitability, soil health and carbon dynamics, wildlife diversity and abundance, water quantity and quality, finances and economics, pollinators and monarch butterflies. And another thing that's not on this list are the human dimensions component, farmer perspectives, and then also we're doing a lot of research into antimicrobial resistance. So the ability of microbes to transfer antibiotic resistance genes in manure, and how prairie strips could possibly mitigate that transfer. So that's interesting work that's coming online here this year. So I just kind of want to give you a highlight of a decade of research on prairie strips. So, you know, the main really big one is the 95% reduction in sediment loss as compared to 100% crops, which is huge. And then a 30% reduction in water runoff, 77% reduction in phosphorus runoff, 70% reduction in nitrogen runoff. And I won't read the rest because I think you guys can read. And then, you know, one of the really big ones, more than triple the pollinator and double the bird abundance. We've demonstrated that there's no influence on crop yield There's no additional weed problems. It's cheaper than installing terraces with a cost comparable to cover crops. And our human dimensions work demonstrates that Iowans are willing to pay for the environmental benefits of the Prairie Strips practice. And here's a result of our most recent Iowa Farm and Rural Life poll. As you would expect, back in 2007, nobody knew what a prairie strip was, and now we can confidently say that almost 80% of folks have heard of prairie strips. A little over 20% want to learn more, and a little less than 20% want prairie strips on their farm. I like to share these practical quotes from our farmer collaborators on why they want prairie strips on their farms. Address my goals for my farm. They seeing the science made it a no-brainer. It doesn't interfere with my spraying management. Prairie strips are cited to minimize conflict with tractor movement. It costs less than terrace, and prairie strips are a practical option. And then, of course, there's the the harder to quantify piece of prairie strips, the spiritual and kind of the prairie bathing piece. I can see and hear the difference. It feels good to farm next to prairie strips. They make my cows happy, so I'm happy. Full of life, like my grandpa's farm when I was a kid. Flowers for my wife, pheasants, honey, and medicinals. It gets the next generation interested in conservation with a purpose. So over a decade of research resulted in a policy in the 2018 Farm Bill that supported prairie strips for cost share in the Conservation Reserve Program, which is a USDA conservation program that gives cost share to farmers that take crop land out of production and enroll it in a conservation practice. So these are kind of the parameters of that policy. It can be up to 25% of a tract. The minimum width is 30 feet. The max is 120 feet. It can be around or through a field alongside waterways in a terrace channel. And the seed mix is native grasses and flowers, which is the first conservation reserve program that requires native grasses and flowers, with a minimum of 2 flowering plants in each spring, summer, and fall, which is also a new requirement. The goals are to reduce soil erosion, improve water quality, and provide wildlife habitat. So with that, we've developed, in partnership with the USDA, an agronomy technical note, which is really useful for conservation planners that want to use the practice standards in the USDA Environmental Quality Incentives Program. So yeah, we started in Ames. Now we have 66 collaborator partnerships with farmers, and now we have all of these acres in CRP and growing. We have 14,000 acres of prairie strips, protecting 140,000 acres of cropland in 14 states. And one metric I really like to share, I did some back of the envelope math the other day, and if we took every prairie strip at 30 feet and put them back to back, it would cross the state or the United States east to west 1.5 times. So it's kind of fun to imagine that. And so now our next steps for where we want to take prairie strips is thinking about how this perennial cover can potentially pay outside of the conservation outcomes. So we're thinking about carbon markets and ecosystem service markets, so soil carbon and sequestration and regeneration, greenhouse gas mitigation. What's the potential of using prairie as a bioenergy crop to integrate into biogas digesters, kind of like a take half, leave half, to produce cellulosic ethanol? Does it have potential as a fiber resource for pulp and paper, prairie clothing? Can we use it as a construction supply? Potential for growth medium, medicinals and pharmaceuticals, and then more niche things like food and beverage, the herbs, teas, and roots, and brewing and distilling. And obviously hunting leases, recreation and ecotourism, photography, and just enjoyment in general. And then the restoration expertise, the need for technical expertise, hiring staff for design and coordination, establishment, management and monitoring. And then livestock, can we use these prairie strips as corridors to access row crops and cover crops? Use it as a way to supplement cool season pastures? Can we hay it? Can we use that hay for bedding? And then again, have that be part of a bioenergy system. And then the pollination benefit, use that to support honey producers and other bee products, help increase crop yield. One of our recent studies suggests that the integrating prairie strips has the potential to increase soybean yields by up to 24%. And then the clean water and flood control and pest control, so natural enemies and pest management, improved pesticide longevity, etc. So that's all I have for you guys, and I'll pass it on to my colleague, Tim Youngquist. Thank you.
All right, hi everybody. Can somebody give me a thumbs up or something that you can see my PowerPoint screen?
Yes,
good.
You're good to go.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, thanks Omar for getting us going, and thanks to PCAP for inviting us to be here. As we were introduced, so my name is Tim Youngquist. I work in the agronomy department here at Iowa State University, and I'm an agricultural specialist and farmer liaison with the Prairie Strips team. I'll talk a little bit about the implementation side of things. But first, since we're talking to a Canadian audience, I want to tell the story of the last 150 years or so in the state of Iowa, because it's a fascinating story. And if you're not familiar with it, I think it's one that bears repeating. You saw the pictures of the hydrologic flumes that Omar was showing that were full of this topsoil. And Iowa is home to a fair portion of the best soil on the planet. This very long period of prairie vegetation and the deep roots and the diversity and the application of fire by Native Americans caused the soil to just be incredibly rich and incredibly deep, and it's very good for row crop production. But how did we get to this point? If you look back about 200 years ago, about 85% of the state of Iowa, or this light yellow color, was tallgrass prairie. Now, in really just a couple short generations, you had what was the dominant ground cover, this perennial, deep-rooted, diverse, ecosystem, has been converted to two crops, corn and soybeans, and those cover 75% of the land area of the state of Iowa. And these things are really only actively drawing up nutrient and absorbing water out of the soil for about 5 months of the year. This is from Boone County, which is pretty close to central Iowa, here where Iowa State University, where Omar and I are located, but really the whole state doesn't look like this. It does. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself, but in just a couple short generations, back around 150 years ago, what was tallgrass prairie then suddenly flipped, and now you can see kind of the current land cover where basically we have row crop everywhere. And it's more than just a story of transition. It's that what once was prairie became agriculture, and then as time has moved on, that agriculture has really intensified, and we've really simplified the system. So here you can see maps from 3 different what are called townships around the state of Iowa, going from the 1930s to the early 2000s. If the only thing that you can really see or take away from this map is that these yellow icons towards the top of the screen, they're a much more colorful patchwork quilt. You had small grains, you had pastures, there was just more diversity, more home sites. And as you've gone on through the decades since, again, there's just been an intensification and an oversimplification of that landscape. And this soil is incredibly productive, and it's incredibly good at producing row crops, but there's been some really pretty drastic unintended consequences. And one of those things would be soil movement, and the other would be nutrient movement. You can see here, this is a picture again from central Iowa, the amount of this rich black topsoil that is just on the move when we have rains down here. And this is much the same story kind of all over the country and all over the upper Midwest here. And again, what I was mentioning with not all these acres are being the same, you have the erosion coming off the flatlands, but there's also a lot of land that is probably not super well suited for row crop production that has been converted from, in this case, what would have been an oak savanna into a row crop field. So that's kind of the story of where we came from. This is kind of, now we're going to talk about where we're going with prairie strips and why this idea started to gain so much traction. So Omar showed the maps of how the project has expanded, and we started at this National Wildlife Refuge and went around and brought these presentations and began to talk to audiences about how you can put a little bit of prairie on your land and see disproportionate benefits. We had a lot of farmers and landowners really ask, how could we get this on our property? You know, how could we be involved? And that was where I became involved in the practice, taking the research that had been done originally with the project and trying to apply that out on farm fields around the state of Iowa. So that's kind of been my specialty. And these folks that are standing here with the Prairie Strips collaborator sign, I've been fortunate enough to work with dozens of individuals like this across Iowa and kind of throughout the Midwest that have put prairie strips on their land, and then we've begun to do research there as well. One of the biggest things that I want to talk about for the rest of this section would be the design and the layout. What would you do if you were interested in something like this on your property? These prairie strips started as an idea for something that could keep soil and water, slow the water flow down as it was leaving the property or as it was leaving the field, and kind of keep some of that sediment in place and then filter out some of those nutrients. So that was kind of what the practice or prairie strips is designed to do. How do you lay out a prairie strip when you're looking to convert, or when you're looking to slow down water flow and absorb some of those nutrients? Well, it depends very much on water flow. So I'll show you a simple graphic here. You think of a stream or a drainage ditch. A lot of times here down in Iowa, you'll have a linear buffer along that stream, whether that's 30 feet or 100 feet or whatever it is. And that's assuming that all the water is flowing evenly to the stream. But except in the most flat conditions, what's actually happening is the water is flowing in more concentrated areas in some parts of the field and less concentrated areas in others. So across this whole section, say the green part makes up 10% of the field. You have 10% of the field buffered. Well, that should be good, but you look at this area of concentrated flow, and what you're actually seeing where the water is flowing through an area in a concentrated pattern, you only have about 4% of that area buffered. The thought being then, you can vary the width of the buffer, strategically place a wider width buffer in areas of concentrated water flow, and that will get better filtration of the water. More sediment will drop out in that buffer before leaving the field and then becoming a problem downstream. And if possible, if it works with the contours, you can then use that edge of field buffer design and begin to buffer up the slope into the field, up the hill, creating contour strips with uniform farming lanes in between them. That said, farming on the contour is not always a possibility. Here's a field where you can see these black squiggles represent what are called contour lines, which basically indicate elevation. A prairie strip, don't be confused by the name and think that it has to be some kind of an infield contour strip. What it can actually be is potentially an edge of field buffer that will filter water and create habitat. You can see we've got a variable width buffer along the west side of this field. Why is that? Well, in those areas, there's actually a larger contributing area, or there's more water being collected from the field flowing to that common point. So by varying the width of that buffer and having a large chunk of prairie where the water is flowing through the field, you're going to do a better job filtering it out, and you don't have to use up so much acreage. You know, having the entire buffer 100 feet wide would be good in some ways, but you're not going to be as effective at controlling that water flow. So if you're really worried about soil and nutrient movement, finding out where the water flows through the field and then buffering the lower edge of the field where you're giving water away, or the upper edge of the field where you're taking water on from someone else, that's always where I start the design. Because again, water does not care. It's just going to flow downhill. It wants the easiest route downhill. And if you can buffer those areas, you know, those are going to be the areas of the problem spots again and again and again, year after year. You know, the water may move a few feet here and there, but it's not going to jump to a different part of the field. So by addressing where the water moves through the field, usually you'll have some kind of a gully, or there'll be some kind of evidence where the water's flowing through. That's where you can begin your buffering. These designs might undergo significant changes. So you can see the red squiggles on this map are indicative of some contour maps that came from the U.S. Department of Agriculture Local Service Center. There's a local service center in each county throughout Iowa, and really throughout each county throughout the United States. Their design for these contour strips is then kind of the almost polar opposite of that would be these pen marks that you see moving across, and that was kind of the back of the pickup tailgate. This is what the farmer wanted as a design. So you can see what the farmer wanted and what the government agency wanted were almost polar opposites of each other. If we're going to do infield conservation and we're going to get farmers and landowners to sign up for these kinds of practices, there has to be some kind of diplomacy, I guess, prairie diplomacy, you could call it. There's got to be some kind of a way that we can find a middle ground. And generally, so on this site, this is what ended up happening. We buffered nearly all of the edge of the field. We took a few small areas, some wet spots, converted them to prairie, and then we put some small contour strips on the lower edge of the field. The thought being, this design is still going to keep soil and sediment in the borders of the field. It may not keep it up on the hills the way that the government agency wanted, but it's not going to interfere with the farm operations as badly as what the government agency would have done. And it's not going to be as arbitrary as maybe what the farmer wanted. So this is just kind of keeping in mind that with farm equipment, you know, down here, there are folks that are regularly using these sprayers, and apologize, I'm not going to convert this to meters, but sprayers that are 120 feet wide. So you can imagine just the size of these implements are just massive, and it can be difficult or impractical to put small strips of vegetation through the field and think that those are going to be managed successfully by someone that maybe isn't interested in the prairie. We're giving them an option like this where it's on the edge of the field. Again, you're still going to create that border that's going to keep the soil and the sediment and provide some habitat within that field, but not creating such maybe a loss of efficiency for that farm. If you're interested in wildlife, so Omar mentioned all the benefits that come from the prairie. One of the things that the farmers and landowners, a lot of them down here, are interested in is wildlife, whether that's, you know, things like game birds or even non-game wildlife like songbirds, grassland birds, pollinators, insects, things like that. If you're interested in wildlife, the wider the strip you could make would be better. We would do no narrower than 30 feet wide, but you can go all the way up to about 120 feet wide. And the wider you get, you're going to have more nest success, and you're going to have better overall habitat for wildlife. Then if you could go one step better and you could provide some connectivity, take that strip and provide it to, or connect it to, you know, some kind of a water body or some other area that then that wildlife can kind of move through, and there can be chances for that population to move around, and maybe other genetic diversity is going to move through there from different animal populations, things like that. Here's a design that kind of shows, if you're talking about wildlife, there's a little pink area to the north of the field where there was just kind of a small, hard to turn around area of the field. We took that, eliminated it, because again, with the farm equipment being so large, it can be time consuming to turn around, lift up the head on the combine, you know, move the hydraulics, all this kind of stuff. It can be more time consuming to farm some of those small areas. So we converted this area to prairie, and north of that, there's a little bit of a treed spot. And then coming south from that, we had a couple prairie strips in the field. And then there's some pretty good buffers that are already along the drainage ditch. So just providing some additional areas for wildlife to be within that field. This is an aerial photo or drone photo of that same field, but you can see, you know, large blocks of habitat. And by varying the width of the infield buffer, it kind of gets, as you can see, the middle strip gets a little bit wider as we're going down the field. What essentially happens is we're making two uniform farming lanes on either side of that strip. What that's doing is not taking away any efficiency from the farmer. So he can have even passes on either side of the strip, no short rows, no point rows. He can go along smoothly and farm those areas. So you can increase efficiency that way, even though you're taking land out of production and you're putting a strip in the middle of the field, you can still increase efficiency by being very mindful of what the equipment width that farmer has. Again, and then talking about farming efficiency, Omar showed this picture already, I believe, but you can see again, just creating these uniform farming lanes, sticking to the contour, but varying it where needed to create these uniform farming lanes to make it easier. Because down here, and I would assume you folks are having some of the same problems, the windows for planting and harvesting and some of these other field operations can be very small some years. There'll be years that we'll have snow in May, when we're trying to get corn seeded. So there'll be some of these windows that they can be really small, and you trying to do anything that's going to take away from the efficiency of the farming operation is going to be a pretty tough sell. So making this something that is going to be as easy as possible is a way that I think we've really gotten a lot of buy-in, and the flexibility of the prairie strips, being able to kind of point to where the farmers want them. Like Omar mentioned, conservation with a purpose. You can really choose, well, what is your goal and how are we going to accomplish that goal? And for the most part, prairie strips is going to hit a lot of those points. How can we lay these things out? There's a lot of ways that you can do it. I kind of did a good, better, best on this sheet. It can be done with an open reel tape, just a simple, maybe a 300 meter or a 100 meter long tape, something like that you can kind of measure, or you could physically count crop rows and get an idea of how far apart you want them to be. Otherwise, if you have a GPS unit, or particularly a GPS unit that has a high degree of accuracy, something that if you're going to be putting infield strips and you're going to be curving and staying pretty close to that contour, something that's within 15 centimeters, something like that, that's going to be pretty close, because again, having that in the wrong place is going to reduce efficiency. So you want to be as accurate as possible when you're laying these things out in the field. What is in the prairie strip? We keep talking about the word prairie. Well, that means a lot of different things, but what I'm talking about is a diverse mix of native, preferably local ecotype seeds. So these would be grasses, both warm and cool season grasses, sedges, legumes, and non-legume forbs. So basically a mix of grasses and flowers that are native and, if at all possible, local ecotype. And that would just be buying seed that's from a reputable seed supplier in the area. That means that seed was grown, say, within 150 miles of where the prairie is going to be planted, because there are subspecies within each of these, big blue stem or white indigo or whatever you're talking about. There's kind of subspecies across their geographic range, and by using local ecotype seed, you can keep the genetic diversity and just the genetic strength of those lines a little bit stronger. Some people are going to be interested in diversity just for diversity's sake, but trying to plant, in the native prairie, there's going to be about, say, over 300 species that are available in some of these remnant prairies that were never plowed. Most of those species are not commercially available, but if you can try to mimic that natural system as much as possible, again, with kind of getting all those different guilds of plants and trying to get as many different types as you can, because by providing all those different types of plants and by providing all that diversity, you're going to do a better job at outcompeting weeds and do a better job of kind of filling in some of those bare spots. And you'll just have a more longevitous, more resilient planting in the long run. Planting time, prairie can be planted pretty much any time of the year. I wouldn't plant prairie on the snow that was deeper than about 4 or 5 inches, and I wouldn't plant in the driest time of the year, which for us is August. My favorite time of the year to plant prairie would be the dormant season. So sometime basically down here, it would be after November 15th, because that will give those wildflowers a chance to have a cold, moist period. Again, these are temperate wildflower species. They need to be cold. They need to experience winter in order to unlock germination. Those seeds need to be conditioned to know that it's like, okay, now it's time to wake up. If they're seeded in the fall, you can broadcast the seed right onto the surface. The freeze thaw of the winter time will work that seed perfectly down into the layer of the soil where it needs to go. Prairie is very hardy. but it can't be planted, any deeper than about 1/4 of an inch. And some of these small seeded species are going to have a very difficult time germinating and finding the surface. So by planting in the fall, you can do a simple broadcast seeding, which is just putting the soil on the surface, and you're going to have, I would say, the best results. And that's kind of my favorite time of the year. You'll have more forbs or flowers that'll show up if you plant that time of the year. We haven't seen, or some of our partner organizations that are completing this research, we haven't seen a difference in grass germination. So if you're specifically interested in grasses, again, you can do that just about any time of the year. But if you want more of the forbs or flowers, a fall planting is going to be more successful. Establishment maintenance, this stuff is sometimes marketed as no maintenance when in fact it's low maintenance. So for the first 2 years, it needs to be maintained through mowing. We tell people that once the vegetative material is about to knee height, you want to go down and mow it to about 4 to 6 inches. Why are we doing this? It gives these deep-rooted perennial species, that these prairie plants that are growing down, and they're only going to be a couple inches tall at the end of the first season. You're giving them a competitive advantage against these annual weeds that are trying to get as big as possible, as fast as possible to produce as much seed. There's a fantastic illustration out of the Tallgrass Prairie Center down here at the University of Northern Iowa. You can see some gray-headed coneflower seedlings to the left and to the right of a ruler in this graphic. The ones on the left were not mowed, the ones on the right were. So by not mowing, you're stranding these seedlings in just a dark forest where they're having trouble getting the nutrients, getting the sunlight, getting the water that they need. We're mowing, knocking down that annual weed cover. You're really getting some robust seedlings, and you're going to get your money's worth with the planting. Beyond the first 2 years, you're going to really want to scout, because there are perennial weeds, things like Canadian thistle is a real problem down here. Some of those perennial weeds need to be controlled through scouting and spot maintenance, whether that's non-chemical control would be mowing or hand pulling. And if you're going to do chemical control, properly timed mowings combined with herbicide application can be a really effective way to kind of knock some of those down, to keep them from becoming a problem in the prairie in later years. And then this is from, I think last year, maybe Omar can remind me, but Omar and I went out and we regularly burn the prairie strips. So this was a landscape, particularly locally here from basically Minneapolis down to Kansas City. This whole area would have burned. It would have been, if there was a fire, the only areas that wouldn't have burned would have been in, wooded ravines and things like that, where the fire couldn't have traveled. But the fire would have been extensive back in 150, 200 years ago, prior to European settlement here in the upper Midwest. So fire was a really, really common part of the prairie, and the prairie needs that disturbance, and it can handle it just fine, where a lot of the invasive weeds, the woody species, some of those things that would not have been here are not able to handle that. So the application of fire is about the closest thing to a magic wand, and the prairie is going to need some kind of disturbance like that repeatedly over its life if it's really going to thrive. This is less meaningful to you folks, but as Omar mentioned, Prairie Strips is now part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Conservation Reserve Program, which essentially just makes it a lot easier for farmers and landowners to get prairie strips down here, which is a big deal. This is a huge victory for the Prairie Strips team, and just kind of for the state of Iowa and for conservation in general. The prairie strips and other conservation practices, they can be applied in a lot of different ways depending upon what your goals are and what the characteristics of that field are going to be. And then one of the biggest things that I want to touch on is just prairie strips. They're good. It's what I do for a living. It's like I help people design and install these things, but they're not going to work on every acre. And they're certainly not going to be the only thing that's going to work. So a combination of conservation practices is always going to be the most effective, rather than relying on one thing. What do I mean by a combination of practices? I'm saying, no-till or reduced tillage, contour farming, planting cover crops when the main crop is off, doing crop rotations, just a variety of different things that you can do, planting waterways, having terraces, all those things. Combining prairie strips is just another tool that farmers and landowners can use, that it's always going to be the most effective. And what's really neat about prairie is just it hits on so many of those things, and then you get the disproportionate benefits to the wildlife, and to the the wildlife, like the birds and the beetles and things like that are so intricately interwoven to this prairie. And I think I'm getting close to done, but yeah, it's just beautiful. You can see flowers blooming throughout the year, and it's very green down here during the growing season, but we don't necessarily have a lot of the flowers because so much of the prairie is gone. But I forgot to mention, of that original 85% land cover that we had, in the early 1800s, 1/10 of 1% is all that remains of that prairie. So we really severed the link to what was there, and in a couple short generations, John Deere invented the moldboard plow, and we destroyed all that prairie. We did it without really thinking. And again, now we've got some of those negative consequences. And I think the way that farmers and landowners are rapidly adopting something like prairie strip shows that it's not perfect, but it's certainly a hope for the future, and a hope that things can kind of get better. And we're doing something so simple as just restoring some of the vegetation that used to be kind of the dominant ground cover here. If you're interested, there are dozens of peer-reviewed scientific publications that are from over almost 15 years of research now, that are at www.prairiestrips.org. You can email prairiestrips@iestate.edu to get in touch with either Omar or myself or any other member of the team. And then we've got a couple spots on social media, on Twitter and Instagram, if you're interested in upcoming talks or just looking at the pictures of the research team and some of the work that we're doing here. We'd be happy to talk to you about any of this other stuff. And I think we've got a few minutes here for questions, if anybody has any questions that they would like, or I can certainly continue to ramble as well.
First of all, thank you both, Tim and Omar, for the great presentation. We do have a few questions right now, and if anyone else has questions, feel free to type it in. We'll start with one from a listener named May. About seed mix content. Are there rules for limiting the proportion of rhizomatous or aggressive grass species, which will reduce the diversity of the planting over the longer term? At the same time, is it these aggressive species that are more common on the market and cheaper?
Yeah, I think I'm not muted anymore. Yeah, that's a good question. And that, I suppose it's probably the same way up there, but that market has really changed, and the thought process behind the prairie seedings have really changed, and continue to change. There's different recommendations on seeds per square foot, and how many pounds per acre, and all these things. And one of the things that we're really fortunate here in the state of Iowa to have the University of Northern Iowa's Tallgrass Prairie Center, that they're a center that is dedicated to studying prairie. And what they've kind of found is that trying to have basically a 50-50 or 60-40 mix with grasses and forbs together is going to be the best thing that you can do, again, to kind of prevent those grasses from just immediately taking over the stand. Because in the past, when restoration first started, yeah, a lot of the things that were available, there was cave-in rock, switchgrass, and some of these things that were coming out of like the southern United States, and that was all that was available. There were some folks that were doing restoration here back in the 1970s, having to buy or looking to buy grasses from South Africa, places like that. The market just really didn't exist here, and that's really matured a lot. And we're lucky here in the upper Midwest to have a lot of seed suppliers, and the interest in native plants continues to grow. But even, probably 10, 12 years ago, there was a lot of pollinator plantings that went in down here that were more of a 70-30, putting 70% forbs or flowers and 30% grasses. And while those were maybe good for pollinators, they just are not that resilient, and they were really open to a lot of weed pressure. So I think now the current science is kind of trying to get as close to that 50-50 mix, avoiding some of the, again, really aggressive species, both on the forb side and the grass side. And
I also want to add to that, Tim, too, that like a 70-30 mix won't be as effective in reducing soil erosion and some of those other benefits that we see with, mitigating water.
That makes sense. Um, did you have anything else to add for that answer, or do you think you've got it there?
Sorry to cut you off. Just trying to add.
You're good. Okay, thank you. I think that answers the question. We've got a couple questions about spraying. Is there any concern about the impacts on impacts from insecticides, both neonics and insecticides used to control soybean aphids? Have you had any thoughts about that?
Yeah, we actually just recently published a couple of papers on neonicotinoids and their effect on nectar and forage resources, and the study demonstrate that there's minimal, if any, effect. And yeah, so far we're not seeing that there's any negative impact on pollinators or natural enemies or anything like that. There's a little bit of residual that gets put in the nectar and the forage resources, but it's way below the lethal dose threshold. If I don't know if you want to add to that, Tim. That's the way I interpret that new study by Mara.
Yeah, and that's something, again, these are really the same common questions that we get a lot, when we go out and give these presentations. I think the word sublethal is probably the best thing there. It's like these neonics, it's like they're moving through the system, and they're moving into the prairie strip, and they're moving into the pollen, but they're at very low levels. And these private farms that we've gone out to as this Prairie Strips 2 that we call it, away from the original research study, it's like we didn't ask anybody to change their management style. We didn't ask them to change what they were applying. We have folks that are, using neonicotinoid seed treatments. We have them that are using, all different kinds of herbicides. So, looking at then, all the different parameters of macroinvertebrates and nest success of birds and honeybees and native bees and all these kind of things. Again, I would refer folks back to our website, but then also keeping in mind, it takes years to answer these questions. And for, a question like that, well, 1 field season's not enough, 2 field, so you're looking at 3, 4, 5 years. So there's areas of active research that we're very much working on, but it will take some time because we just can't, as a university and as a research group, can't move as fast as people want answers to these questions. But I would encourage you guys plant some prairie strips and can get your local universities to start doing research on them.
If you want to look at that quantified data too, just go to prairiestrips.org. We have a publications page, and that paper is actually at the top of the list because we just published that by our PhD student Mara Hall. And so interesting findings.
Yeah, for sure. That sounds great. That sounds like a great resource. And it looks like the website's right there. So people can definitely check that out. We have quite a few questions about establishment. Like the rate of evolution of prairie strips, how much time does it take for the native plants to come in and to spread? And does it eventually evolve to something closer to native prairie? And does it take like 50 to 100 years? Any thoughts about that?
So prairies generally take reconstructed prairie generally takes about 3 years to start looking at anything like a prairie. It really spends the first 3 years growing down rather than up, because you're mowing it to control weeds, to get that light interception, to make sure that those roots of the prairie seedlings are establishing. But I think our research on vegetative community demonstrates it takes around anywhere from 3 to 7 years for it to really start looking like a prairie community. And with Tim being the one that does most of the prairie establishment, I think he might have some more to add to that.
Yeah, I think there's a spot up by Madison, Wisconsin, kind of in the northern part of the United States. It's the longest tenured prairie reconstruction, and I think it's close to 100 years old. And I would say that that has more in common with the 3rd year planting than it does with a remnant prairie. You think about some of these things have been in place here in Iowa, some of the remnant prairies we have that might be 12 to 15,000 years old. It's like there are interactions with the soil microbial community, with the interaction. I mean, a way to think of it, I guess, would be a prairie reconstruction, or these prairie strips just in general would be a finger painting versus a Dutch masters. It's like there's just, it maybe over time will turn into that, but as humanity, man, we don't necessarily have an answer to that at this point. But by providing the diversity up front, you can really you can get something that's going to be just more resilient into the future, planting more diversity up front.
I'll add to, in general, prairie strips are anywhere from 30 to 60 species. So like in comparison, like, that finger painting analogy is like pretty accurate, because a real true native prairie might have had something upwards of 400 species at, any given time, which is it's not a static entity either, right? It's a dynamic ecosystem that fluxes depending on the year. You might have compass plant blooming in one year and then it doesn't come back for like 4 or 5 years or something like that too. So yeah, it's a time game.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And do you have any comments about the planting success rate when you're initially planting the prairie strips?
Yeah, I think, like Tim said, it's not no maintenance, it's low maintenance, and it really depends on the producer's willingness to get out there and spot treat weeds and mow consistently in the first year to make sure that annual weeds and, perennial weeds don't establish themselves. So yeah, it just depends on the context, on, the amount of prep you do, whether it was in corn or beans first. We recommend doing it after soybeans. It seems to be easier to establish, and you don't have to get through that corn stover to get that seed broadcasted or drilled in. But yeah, I think it just depends on how much you want to put in. But if you do it properly, I would say we have a pretty good, 90 to 100% success rate on prairie establishment.
Wow, that's awesome. That's great.
And,
Are there any?
just a key point there, Mother Nature, right? If it's really dry, or if it's really wet, or you have a 7-inch rain, or so, some kind of thing like that, it's like, well, you're probably going to have a pretty good chance that something's going to go haywire. So as long as there's not extreme weather, you have a very good chance of success.
That's good to know. And the next question is actually how you think the system would work in more arid environments with less moisture.
Yeah, we've expanded our work here in Iowa from down to like southern Missouri and into the panhandle of Nebraska, where you have a lot more of those sand communities. And we're just trying to figure that out at this point. I would say they're probably going to be a little bit slower to establish, a little bit maybe less resilient to getting going. But once they get started, again, the plant communities, there's sand communities, sand prairies here in Iowa, and generally the species composition can be a little bit different. Maybe the plants are a little bit smaller, but again, the principle is the same. You want to have a diverse mix of species, your grasses, your forbs, and if you're going to try to restore some kind of a sand prairie or any kind of prairie, really go to prairies that are in your area. Find natural spaces and look what is out there, what does that look like, what species are there, and then just kind of try to use that as your template. Talk to other people in your neighborhood or experts that you can rely on.
That's great. That gives us some hope for the dry area that I'm in, and especially during a time of drought like this. So thanks for that answer. The next question is, are there any regulatory or legal agreements available to ensure these strips are maintained over time, perhaps between landowners, similar to a conservation agreement?
So yeah, if they're signed up under the Conservation Reserve Program, that is a contractual obligation to maintain that planting over a 10 to 15-year period. But if they're planting it out of pocket just as an individual private citizen, then yeah, they don't have any obligation to maintain a prairie. But since they're paying it out of pocket, that's kind of their obligation, right, to maintain that investment that they made. But depending on which contract they sign up for, yeah, they'll either be 10 to 15 years, or if they do it under a different program, it could be 3 to 5. It just kind of depends.
Cool, that's really neat. A comment from a listener: awesome research and content. We could definitely benefit from a program like this here in Saskatchewan, and I agree. And followed by a question: what has been most helpful in getting producers to buy into your program? Does the funding for planting significantly help with uptake, or do you think people just realize the benefits of it?
Yeah, I think, having over a decade of research really helps. Like seeing the science is huge. We need, in the beginning, we need to really demonstrate that this practice had value outside of conservation outcomes to farmers. So, installing them where it might be in a marginal area or sub-profitable area in a row crop field, but I think, yeah, the science is number one. That's really what we're at our core, is we're a research team, and yeah, we continue to buffer our findings. But that initial finding that we published in 2012, I think, but then added more data to that and published again in 2017, that there's a 95% reduction in soil loss, is like pretty eye-opening, and I think that gets people interested in their foot in the door. And yeah, and then seeing other farmers do it too, right? Like, oh, that person's crazy enough to do that, maybe I'll do it too.
Have you had any problems with wildlife impact on crops, for example, losses to grazing or trampling?
We haven't really seen that. I would say that the prairie strips are not really going to become a wildlife draw in areas that maybe you have deer browse or something like that, where they're eating the crop. We've seen, maybe where they'll use the strip as a corridor, and then there'll be maybe heavier browsing along the strip, but it'll reduce overall deer browse, say along the woodland edge, something like that. It's like, I don't have hard numbers for it, but just anecdotally, it seems to, you're not really drawing in more birds. You're not really drawing in more things like that. You're just giving them another option, basically, and versus a ditch or a waterway or something like that. It's like, it just gives them another area that they can sleep, or they can have their babies or things like that.
Which is great. And a listener named Graham is wondering if you have any figures on increased crop yields adjacent to your crop strips. Like, do you have an economic analysis to show the cost savings or an increase in value for farmers?
Yeah, our colleague John Tyndall is an economist, and he has multiple publications on the field scale financial assessment. There's a publication in 2013 that he could reference if he's interested in looking at that. And then also the data showing the influence on crop yield is still coming online, because it's actually more nuanced than we realized. But as far as we know right now, that there's no proportionate change in yield. So if you take something that's low producing, you're actually in the red, and place that in prairie strips, that's benefiting the overall operation. And then we do have data on the soybean yields. Again, I would encourage you to look at the publications page on our website. But I think we have that was 2021 on the soybean yields data. And like I mentioned in my presentation, there's potential to increase soybean yields up to 24%, is what that data suggests.
Wow, that's awesome. A couple people are wondering about how you can prevent herbicide drift, so the herbicide drifting from the crop field onto the prairie strip.
Yeah, that's one of the most common things, and yeah, it's absolutely a concern. I would say the biggest thing, just reading and following label instructions on the herbicide. When it don't do anything that's out of the prescription of what you should do when you're spraying. Don't spray when it's too windy, don't spray when it's too hot, don't spray when it's too early in the day, too late in the day, whatever the restrictions might be. Don't tank mix things that shouldn't be mixed together. You can do things to reduce volatility or reduce drift. What we noticed at the original Neil Smith strips, like here in the summer in Iowa, the prevailing winds are from the south. So if we would have any kind of spray drift issues, the southern couple feet of the strip may have species that would, curl or cup or turn brown or maybe not bloom. But again, these things have deep, thick roots. So generally you're going to come back from the roots each year if you have just a drift incident. If you have where the spray boom is put directly over the strip, then yeah, you're probably going to be talking about reseeding. So, just being as conscientious as you can be. And that's where, as the diagram that I showed that had the red squirrels, and then you had the, the black lines, then what we ended up doing was just a border. If you're in a situation where you're worried about that, do that kind of picture frame around the edge of the field, because then essentially all you're doing is just moving that field border in. And something that I like to think about it, if say you were farming next to a housing development or even your neighbor's house or something, and it was their nice turf grass next to your field, you wouldn't want to overspray that either. Just treat it like it's a land use that needs to be, just treat it a little bit differently. You need to be a little bit more conscientious. And whether that's finding the right wind or the right conditions or whatever it is, it's like you just have to be a little bit more careful when you're spraying around them. So it is a concern, but without a direct hit, they seem to be pretty resilient.
I'll add too, anecdotally, that farmers that install prairie strips are inherently conservation minded, so they're pretty careful around the strip and being mindful of that.
That's great. I'm just realizing the time here. We've got lots of questions still. Is it okay if I just ask one more?
You bet.
Okay. There's a couple people wondering about livestock grazing on the strips. Is there, any desire to bring livestock in as a disturbance, or should they be fenced out for people with mixed farming?
No, definitely. That's something that we're really interested in expanding into our research, which we're hoping to do by this time next year. But yeah, we do have a producer actually in central Iowa that installed prairie strips to add, value to his cool season pastures so that he could get cows in there in the warm season. And, I think there's a misconception that livestock can affect nesting and that sort of thing. Like in CRP, in the Conservation Reserve Program, it doesn't allow grazing during the nesting season. But the science demonstrates the opposite, that cattle and livestock actually increase bird abundance and diversity and don't have a direct impact on nesting. So those are some of the questions that we're interested in, validating and can we use prairie strips as corridors at the right time of year to access cover crops so that we can isolate them from the row crop field with, polywire and then use those, if like one farm had a prairie strip and the other farm had a prairie strip, could we use cattle as a road, or prairie strip as a road to get to those cover crops? But yeah, we're hoping to do that and expand our research in that direction.
Awesome. Thanks for that answer. I think that's all the time that we have for today. So I just want to thank you both for sharing all of your research with us. It's fascinating. And as one of our listeners said, it would be great if we could have something like that here in Saskatchewan. And this is how it gets started, with just kind of seeing what you guys are doing, what's working, and then we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So thank you both for the fabulous presentation today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you. And in terms of getting something going up there, it's a pipe dream maybe, but it's like we are real people and this is really happening and we're down here. So you can email us, call us anytime, and we'd be happy to help.
That's awesome. That's awesome. To all of our listeners, thank you so much for attending today's webinar. We have another one happening at 3 p.m. about ecological goods and services from an Indigenous perspective. Feel free to tune in for that. We also have a few other webinars going on this week too. And when you leave today's webinar, there'll be a quick 1-minute survey. If you don't mind filling it out, we really appreciate it. Sorry I wasn't able to get to everyone's questions. We had lots of questions and they were really great. But for those of you who we weren't able to reach out to, just connect with Tim and Omar. Their information's on the screen there. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.